Welcome to the Unveiled Epic Echoes channel. Today, we're diving deep into an unexplored historical mystery in the vast, untamed wilderness of Montana, where the Rocky Mountains rise like ancient sentinels guarding secrets from a time long before settlers crossed the plains. There lies a stretch of road known only to those who dare to whisper its name. Highway 13, winding through the Bitterroot Valley like a vein through the heart of the earth. It's a road that promises solitude, the kind that soothes the soul with its endless vistas of pine-draped peaks and crystal-clear streams tumbling down from snow-capped heights. But beneath that serene facade hides a forgotten truth, one that echoes from the days when Native American tribes spoke of spirits that claimed the land for their own, vanishing wanderers into the mist without a trace. Our story begins with Alex, a history professor from Billings, a man in his mid-40s with a penchant for dusty archives and untold tales, who had always been drawn to the fringes of American lore, those hidden chapters where fact blurred into legend, like the lost expeditions of Lewis and Clark that veered off maps into oblivion. Alex had heard murmurs of mile marker 13 during a late-night conversation at a roadside diner in Missoula, where an old rancher with weathered hands and eyes, shadowed by decades of Montana winters, leaned in close over his black coffee and said, in a voice as low as the wind through the lodgepole pines, that folks around there didn't talk about that stretch, not since the 1920s, when loggers first carved the path through the mountains, unearthing arrowheads and strange carvings that seemed to depict roads swallowing men whole, symbols the tribes had warned against disturbing. Intrigued by this sliver of unexplored history, Alex packed his old Jeep with notebooks, a thermos of strong coffee, and a digital recorder, setting out under a sky painted in the soft hues of dawn, the kind that makes the world feel new and full of possibility. Even as the isolation begins to wrap around you like a gentle fog, the drive started pleasantly enough, with the highway unfurling before him like a ribbon through the forest, flanked by towering evergreens that whispered softly in the breeze, their needles carpeting the ground in a hush that invited reflection on the land's ancient past, back to the Salish people who once roamed these valleys, telling stories of a cursed path where the earth itself hungered for travelers, a myth dismissed by modern maps, but etched into the collective memory of the locals who now steered clear, opting for longer routes through safer passes. As Alex cruised past mile markers 1 through 12, the radio played classic country tunes, Johnny Cash's gravelly voice crooning about walking the line, a fitting soundtrack for this solitary journey into the unknown. But as he approached mile marker 13, a rusted sign, half buried in underbrush with faded paint that barely read the number, something shifted in the air a subtle thickening, like the atmosphere before a summer storm. Though the sky remained a flawless blue, the radio crackled then, the signal distorting into a garbled mess of static, interspersed with faint echoes of voices that sounded almost human, words like turn back or lost flickering in and out. But Alex chalked it up to the mountains interfering with the waves, a common occurrence in these remote parts where cell service was as unreliable as the weather. He pressed on, the road narrowing as it climbed higher, the landscape growing more isolated, with sheer cliffs dropping off to one side and dense forest pressing in on the other. The kind of natural beauty that draws hikers and photographers, but also reminds you how small you are against the grandeur of America's wild heart. Hours passed in that eerie silence, broken only by the hum of his tires on the asphalt, and Alex found himself pondering the historical anomalies he'd researched, like the unexplained disappearance of a stagecoach in 1887, carrying gold miners from Virginia City, last seen near what would become mile marker 13. Their wagons found abandoned with horses still harnessed, but no sign of the men. Their tracks simply ending as if the ground had opened up and swallowed them. A case the territorial investigators quietly shelved, citing bears or bandits, though no evidence supported either. Then there was the 1950s incident with a family of 4 in a station wagon, vacationing from Seattle, who vanished after a postcard sent from a nearby town mentioned excitement about the scenic drive ahead. Search parties combed the area for weeks, finding only a child's teddy bear by the roadside, its fur matted with dew as if left moments before. But no tire marks, no wreckage, just that lingering void that made the locals nod knowingly and change the subject. Alex stopped at a pullout to stretch his legs, the air crisp with the scent of pine and earth. And as he gazed out over the valley below, dotted with wildflowers in shades of purple and gold, he felt a strange awareness, as if the road itself was watching, its curves and dips not random, but deliberate, like veins leading to a hidden pulse deep within the mountain. Shaking off the notion, he continued, but the distortions grew worse. His GPS flickered, showing him miles off course one moment and frozen the next. And the radio now emitted a low hum that vibrated through the Jeep, interspersed with snippets of old broadcasts, perhaps from decades past, talking about lost patrols during the frontier wars, soldiers who marched into the mist and never returned, their reports buried in government archives as desertions to avoid panic. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that danced across the pavement like fingers reaching out. And Alex noticed how empty the road was. No oncoming traffic, no wildlife stirring, just that profound silence that pressed in, making his thoughts echo louder in his mind. He recalled interviewing a retired sheriff in Hamilton, a grizzled man named Earl who sipped whiskey by a crackling fire and spoke of aborted investigations. How in the 70s, a team of state troopers set up checkpoints after a trucker went missing. His rig found idling with lights on but cab empty, logs still strapped down. Yet when they delved deeper, evidence vanished, photos blurred, tapes erased, as if the mountain erased its own history. Earl had warned Alex, his voice a soothing murmur like the river's flow, that some roads were best left to the ghosts of the past, tied to ancient curses from when the land was disturbed by miners blasting through sacred sites, unearthing petroglyphs depicting a serpentine path that consumed souls, forgotten truths that the tribes had sealed away, but now stirred anew. Night fell gently, stars emerging like pinpricks in a velvet sky, and Alex's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating twists that seemed to shift subtly, as if the road was breathing, alive with the weight of all those who had vanished before hikers, truckers, lovers on elopements, each leaving behind only whispers in the wind. He felt a pull, a subtle dread that built not in screams, but in the quiet realization that he hadn't seen another soul for hours. His phone dead despite full charge, the radio now silent except for a faint, rhythmic pulse like a heartbeat from the earth below. In that isolation, amid the majestic peaks that had stood witness to centuries of hidden stories, Alex pondered if the road was a remnant of something older, a line or ancient pathway where realities thinned, claiming vehicles and lives not out of malice, but indifference, erasing them into the fabric of the landscape itself. As he rounded a bend, his Jeep sputtered, the engine dying without warning, coasting to a stop just past where mile marker 13 should have been, though now it was gone, vanished like so much else. He stepped out into the cool night air, the silence absolute, no crickets, no owls, just the stars above and the road stretching endlessly, aware, waiting, flashlight in hand. He walked a few paces, calling out, but his voice swallowed by the void. And in that moment, the dread settled like a soft blanket, unanswered questions swirling. What ancient force claimed this path? What forgotten truth lay buried in the soil? And would he too become part of the mystery? His Jeep found empty by some future seeker. The mountain loomed, eternal and indifferent, its secrets veiled in the gentle hush of the night, leaving only the lingering sense that some histories were meant to remain unexplored, drifting into the ether like dreams on the edge of sleep. As the flashlight beam pierced the enveloping darkness, Alex felt the weight of the silence pressing down on him like the heavy snows that blanketed these mountains in winter. A quiet so profound, it seemed to absorb even the sound of his own breathing, leaving him adrift in a sea of nothingness that stretched from the asphalt under his feet to the starlit heavens above. He turned back to the Jeep, its engine still warm but unresponsive, the keys dangling uselessly in the ignition, as if mocking his reliance on modern machinery in this primal landscape, where the Salish legends spoke of paths that shifted with the moon's phases, claiming interlopers who disturbed the sacred balance forged eons ago, when glaciers carved the valleys and ancient peoples etched their warnings into stone. With no cell signal and the road's curves disappearing into shadow, Alex decided to walk forward, reasoning that civilization couldn't be far, perhaps a ranger station or a pull-off where truckers rested, though deep down he knew the locals' tailies suggested otherwise. Stories of prospectors in the gold rush era who ventured too far, their claims filed in Helena, only to have their names stricken from records when searches yielded nothing but echoes in the wind. The gravel crunched softly under his boots, each step echoing faintly in his ears despite the mute forest around him. And as he progressed, he noticed odd details that gnawed at his historian's mind. Tire tracks that abruptly ended in the middle of the lane, as if the vehicle had lifted off into the air, reminiscent of the 1930s aviation mystery, where a small plane en route from Bozeman vanished mid-flight over this very range, radar blips fading without explanation. The pilot's last transmission, a garbled plea about the road below calling. The air grew cooler, a mist rising from the ground like breath from some subterranean entity, and Alex's thoughts drifted to the unpublished journals he'd unearthed in the Montana Historical Society archives. Entries from fur trappers in the early 1800s describing a hungry trail where companions disappeared during night watches, their bedrolls found untouched, fires still smoldering, as if they'd simply stepped into another realm layered over this one, a hidden stratum of reality where time and space folded upon themselves, guarded by the spirits of those who'd been taken before. He paused to examine a weathered fence post by the roadside, its wood etched with faint scratches that could have been claw marks or deliberate carvings, similar to the petroglyphs discovered in the 1890s during railroad surveys, symbols the Crow tribe interpreters refused to translate, muttering about a curse from the time when volcanic upheavals shaped the land, burying entire villages and their secrets under layers of ash now eroded into these haunting peaks. The dread built slowly, not in flashes of terror, but in the creeping realization that the landscape itself seemed to respond to his presence. The trees leaning slightly inward, branches like skeletal fingers brushing the fog, and distant howls that weren't quite wolves, more like distorted echoes of human cries from forgotten eras. Perhaps the doomed homesteaders of the Dust Bowl migration who sought refuge in these mountains, only to vanish. Their covered wagons later spotted by aerial surveys, but empty upon ground approach. Provisions scattered as if in haste, yet no footprints leading away. Alex's flashlight flickered, the beam weakening despite fresh batteries, casting erratic shadows that danced across the pavement. And in one brief illumination, he thought he saw a figure ahead, silhouetted against the mist. But when he called out, the shape dissolved into nothing, leaving only the lingering scent of exhaust and something metallic, like blood or rust, evoking the unsolved case of the 1960s, whose thumbs-up poses were captured in a Polaroid found miles away. Their bodies never recovered. Investigations halted when evidence logs inexplicably went missing from the county sheriff's office. Pressing on, the road began to incline sharply, winding through a pass where boulders loomed like ancient guardians. And Alex recalled the oral histories he'd recorded from a Blackfeet elder in Browning, tales of a whispering way predating European arrival, where warriors sent to scout enemy tribes entered and emerged changed, speaking of visions where the path revealed buried truths, mass graves from intertribal wars, artifacts from lost civilizations that predated even the indigenous peoples, perhaps remnants of Ice Age nomads whose tools hinted at advanced knowledge, erased by cataclysms. The mist thickened, cloaking the stars, and Alex's pace slowed as fatigue set in, his mind weaving connections between these disparate vanishings, a pattern emerging like threads in a tapestry, each disappearance tied to disturbances of the land, from mining blasts that cracked open forbidden chambers to road constructions that severed lines. Invisible energies the ancients mapped with stone alignments, now overgrown and forgotten. Suddenly, a faint light appeared in the distance. Not headlights, but a soft glow emanating from what looked like an abandoned vehicle pulled off to the side, its doors ajar, engine hood up, as if someone had been tinkering moments before. And as Alex approached, heart pounding in the stillness, he saw it was a vintage pickup from the 40s, rusted but intact, with a license plate from an era when Montana plates bore slogans like Big Sky Country. Yet no dust accumulated on its surface, as if it had just arrived from another time. Inside, the cab held relics, a faded map with routes marked in pencil, leading to mile marker 13 circled in red, and a journal open to a page dated 1947, the handwriting shaky. The road knows our names, pulls us in like the river claims the unwary. Saw the others today, waving from the fog, but when I reached, they were gone. Tell my wife. The entry trailing off into smudges. Alex's hands trembled as he pocketed the journal. The implications sinking in this wasn't just a string of accidents, but a continuum, a historical vortex where the past bled into the present, claiming those who sought to uncover it. Much like the archaeologist in the 1980s who excavated a site nearby, unearthing anomalous bones that carbon dating, only to disappear and root back to the university. His findings dismissed as hoaxes when replicas turned up blank. The glow dimmed, and Alex felt a tug, an invisible force urging him deeper into the mist, where shapes flickered, ghostly outlines of wagons, cars, even a biplane wreckage half buried in vines, each a testament to the road's appetite, fed by the isolation that made Montana's wilderness both a haven and a trap, its natural splendor masking the dread of the unknown. He resisted, turning back toward his jeep, but the path seemed longer now, the mile marker reappearing twisted and upside down, as if mocking his attempt to escape. And in that moment, the silence broke with a whisper, not from the wind, but from within, murmuring names of the lost, inviting him to join the hidden story that the mountains guarded so jealously. Days later, search parties would comb the area, finding Alex's jeep idling with lights on, notebooks scattered, but pages blank, as if erased by an unseen hand, adding his name to the ledger of unanswered questions that lingered like the eternal fog over the peaks. A reminder that some truths from America's untamed past were meant to remain veiled, drifting eternally in the quiet embrace of the night. As the search parties retreated under the gray dawn light, their flashlights cutting futile swaths through the lingering mist that clung to the pines like reluctant spirits. The locals in the nearby town of Darby exchanged knowing glances over steaming mugs at the corner cafe, where the walls were adorned with faded photographs of bygone eras, loggers posing proudly with axes, homesteaders in sepia tones smiling against the backdrop of these same unforgiving mountains, images that hid the darker undercurrents of Montana's history, the ones whispered about in hushed tones after the tourists had left for the season. No one spoke openly of Alex's disappearance, just as they hadn't for the countless others. But in the quiet hours, old-timers like Mabel, the diner owner whose family had run the place since the Great Depression, would sometimes let slip fragments of the deeper lore, tales not found in any history book, but passed down through generations, rooted in the volcanic soil that had birthed these peaks millions of years ago, when lava flows entombed ancient forests, and perhaps something more primordial, entities that slumbered until disturbed by the clamor of human progress. Mabel remembered her grandfather, a trapper who claimed to have seen the road breathe during a blizzard in 1912, snowdrifts parting like waves to reveal glimpses of vehicles from futures not yet come, spectral headlights flickering in the whiteout before vanishing, leaving only the echo of engines that hummed with an unnatural timbre, a sound that infiltrated dreams and drove men mad. Back on the road, though unseen by the living, the mist coalesced into forms that mimicked the lost. Alex now among them, his essence woven into the fabric of the path, aware in a way that transcended flesh, feeling the subtle vibrations as another vehicle approached from the valley below. A young couple, Sarah and Tom, on a spontaneous road trip from Missoula, their SUV loaded with camping gear and playlists of folk songs evoking the American West's romantic solitude, oblivious to the warnings buried in online forums where anonymous posters shared cryptic accounts of distorted CB radio calls, pleading for help in voices that matched missing persons reports from decades prior. As they passed mile marker 12, the air grew heavy, pregnant with the scent of ozone and damp earth, and Sarah fiddled with the radio, static crackling like distant thunder, interspersed with fragments of old news broadcasts about unsolved cases. A convoy of WWII-era trucks hauling supplies through the pass in 1943, vanishing with no wreckage, official reports attributing it to avalanches, though no snow had fallen that mild autumn. Or the 1970s Environmental Survey team, whose equipment recorded seismic anomalies just before they dropped off the grid. Tapes later recovered with audio of whispers in an unknown tongue. Linguists baffled as it echoed Proto-Indo-European roots, twisted into something alien. Tom laughed it off as poor reception, but Sarah felt a chill, the kind that seeps into bones like the cold from glacial meltwaters. And as mile marker 13 loomed, warped, and inverted in the headlights' glare, the SUV's dashboard lights dimmed, gauges spinning erratically, as if the vehicle itself recoiled from what lay ahead. The road seemed to narrow, trees encroaching like sentinels awakened, their branches scraping the roof with a sound like fingernails on chalkboard. And in the mirror, Tom glimpsed fleeting shapes, silhouettes of figures in period clothing, miners with lanterns, native warriors with feathered headdresses, all waving silently as if in warning or invitation. The engine stuttered, a low groan emanating not from the motor, but from beneath the asphalt, vibrating through the chassis like the pulse of some colossal heart buried deep in the mountain's core, tied to geological anomalies scientists had noted, but never explained, fault lines that didn't match tectonic models, perhaps remnants of an ancient caldera where sacrificial rites were performed by forgotten cultures predating the Clovis people, their blood offerings seeping into the stone to nourish whatever entity claimed dominion over this stretch. Sarah clutched Tom's arm, her voice a whisper lost in the growing hum, as the radio burst to life with a cacophony of overlapped voices, children laughing from the 1950s family vanishing, soldiers cursing from the frontier patrols, Alex's own recorded notes reciting historical facts in a loop that devolved into pleas, and then silence, absolute and devouring. The SUV coasting to a halt amid the fog that now swirled with purpose, tendrils forming patterns like the petroglyphs unearthed in forbidden digs, symbols that pulsed with faint luminescence. They stepped out, calls for help echoing back distorted, their phones displaying impossible dates from centuries past. And as they ventured forward, hand in hand, the ground softened subtly, not mud, but something yielding, alive, pulling them inch by inch into the embrace of the road that remembered every soul it had claimed, layering them into its eternal archive of hidden horrors, where time folded like the crumpled maps in abandoned glove compartments, unanswered questions multiplying like shadows at dusk. What primordial force stirred when the first shovel broke earth here? What cosmic alignment made this vein of asphalt a conduit for the vanished? And how many more would heed the call of Montana's wild beauty, only to become footnotes in a story without end? Weeks later, their SUV would be found by hikers, doors open, keys in ignition. A single journal entry scrawled in Sarah's hand. The road sees us, knows our fears, and whispers them back in the dark. The locals would shake their heads. Investigations would falter with evidence evaporating like morning dew. And the mountain would settle back into its watchful quiet, the horror deepening in the unspoken knowledge that the land itself was the predator, patient and inexorable, its appetite whetted by the forgotten truths of America's shadowed past, lulling the unwary into an eternal, dreamless repose. As the years slipped by like shadows lengthening across the Bitterroot Valley, the road remained unchanged, its asphalt cracked in places where frost heaves pushed up from below, weeds reclaiming the shoulders in silent rebellion against the human imposition that had the ancient earth, a scar that never fully healed because the wound ran deeper than steel and concrete, reaching into strata where volcanic glass and obsidian veins whispered of cataclysmic births long before the first mammoth hunters crossed the Burying Land Bridge. In the small communities dotted along the flanks of the mountains Darby, folks learned to live with the absence, the way one lives with a missing limb, feeling phantom sensations of those who'd gone before, hearing faint echoes in the wind that swept down from the passes, carrying snippets of conversation from lives interrupted mid-sentence. By the winter of 2025, with snow piling high against barn doors, and the northern lights occasionally dancing green and purple across the sky, a new seeker arrived, drawn by the digital breadcrumbs left in obscure corners of the internet forums long archived, threads buried under layers of skepticism grainy YouTube videos where blurred dashcam footage showed mile marker 13 flickering like a glitch in reality. Her name was Lena, a true crime podcaster from Seattle with a voice like warm honey over late-night airwaves, known for delving into cold cases that official channels had abandoned. Her episodes lulling thousands into sleep with their measured cadence and meticulous research into America's forgotten tragedies. Lena had stumbled upon the pattern while cross-referencing missing persons databases, noticing the cluster around that remote stretch of Highway 13. Cases spanning over a century with no bodies, no wreckage beyond abandoned vehicles, and investigations that dissolved like mist under morning sun, files misplaced, witnesses recanting vague memories, evidence degrading inexplicably in storage. Armed with high-end recording equipment, thermal cameras, and a drone for aerial sweeps, she set out in her rugged, the heater blasting against the biting cold that seeped through even the best insulation. Her playlist, a soothing mix of ambient folk tunes that evoked wide-open spaces and quiet introspection. The drive from Missoula was picturesque. Snow-dusted pines glittering under weak December sunlight, elk grazing in distant meadows, the kind of serene American landscape that made one feel connected to something vast and timeless. Yet, as she ascended into the higher elevations, the radio began its familiar betrayal. Stations dissolving into white noise laced with anomalous broadcasts. Old emergency alerts from the 1980s ash fall of Mount Helens, though hundreds of miles away. Fragmented CB chatter from truckers who'd vanished in the 90s, their handles still listed in outdated logs. And beneath it all, a subsonic thrum that vibrated in her chest like the approach of an unseen avalanche. Lena noted it calmly, her journalist's instinct cataloging the phenomena even as a deeper unease settled, the kind that comes not from fear of the unknown, but recognition of patterns too consistent to dismiss, echoing the suppressed reports from geologists in the early 1900s who mapped magnetic anomalies here, compasses spinning wildly as if the Earth's core twisted beneath this specific vein, findings quietly omitted from published surveys to avoid alarming settlers pushing westward. As mile marker 13 approached, half obscured by drifting snow, the drone she launched earlier lost signal abruptly, its feed freezing on an image of the road curving unnaturally, almost looping back on itself in defiance of topography. And when Lena glanced at her GPS, it showed her stationary in the middle of nowhere, coordinates shifting to latitudes that belonged to ancient seabeds long uplifted into these peaks. This engine coughed, lights dimming as if sapped by an invisible drain, and she coasted to the shoulder amid a silence so complete it rang in her ears the snow muffling even the fall of flakes from the laden branches overhead. Stepping out, bundled in layers against the sub-zero chill, Lena activated her recorder, speaking softly into the void about the historical context, the land's violent past, riven by earthquakes that swallowed whole rivers in prehistoric times, petrified forests unearthed in road cuts, revealing trees with bark etched by forces unknown, perhaps lightning or something that mimicked it from below. The mist rose again, not from warmth, but from the ground itself, exhaling like a living entity stirring from of slumber, carrying scents of pine resin mixed with something acrid, like scorched metal from long ago impacts or deeper fires that burned in subterranean chambers. Shapes materialized in the haze, first as heat shimmers despite the cold, then coalescing into translucent figures. A scout on horseback from the 1877 flight, his mount pausing as if sensing the trap. A Model T stalled with flappers frozen in 1920s attire, waving futilely. Alex's silhouette with notebook in hand, Sarah and Tom embracing, as the fog enveloped them, all layered in a spectral tableau that played out without sound. A silent film of entrapment repeating across eras, bound by the road's insatiable curiosity or hunger for those who probed its secrets. Lena felt it then, the awareness pressing not as malice, but as an immense, indifferent attention, the mountain itself cognizant through eons, its consciousness woven from the electromagnetic storms trapped in quartz veins, amplified by the iron-rich ores that drew wanderers like moths to flame, claiming them not to destroy, but to incorporate, adding their stories to the buried archive where truths from lost epics, migrations of peoples who built megaliths now crumbled to dust, rituals invoking entities from starless voids, remained preserved in a stasis beyond human comprehension. Her recorder captured whispers, layered voices murmuring in tongues that shifted from Salish to archaic English, to something guttural and prehuman, pleading and warning in equal measure. As her footsteps sank deeper into snow that shouldn't have been so yielding, the ground subtly undulating like breath. In the end, resistance faded into acceptance. The horror not in violence, but in the profound loneliness of joining something eternal, yet utterly alien. The podcaster's final transmission, a soothing narration of the beauty around her. The stars emerging as clouds parted, inviting listeners to drift into the same peaceful oblivion. Come spring thaw, rangers would find the buried under drifts, doors ajar, equipment intact, but memory cards wiped clean. A single note in Lena's handwriting. The road remembers everything we forget. It's not cruel, it's complete. And the cycle continued, the mountain's quiet vigil unbroken, its depths enriched by another layer of unspoken history, lulling the world above into the gentle illusion of untouched wilderness, where the deepest horror lay in the serene certainty that some places were never meant for passage, only for keeping. As the spring of 2026 melted the last stubborn patches of snow from the high passes, revealing rivulets that carved temporary streams across the asphalt like tears on an ancient face, the road settled into its familiar rhythm of quiet anticipation, the pines swaying gently in breezes that carried the fresh scent of thawing earth and budding wildflowers, a renewal that masked the perpetual hunger lying just beneath the surface, patient as the geological epochs that had shaped this corner of Montana into a labyrinth of hidden chambers and forgotten cataclysms. Word of Lena's disappearance spread slowly through the digital ether, first in niche true crime subreddits, where enthusiasts dissected the abrupt end to her final episode, a live-streamed drive that cut to silence mid-sentence as she described the almost hypnotic beauty of the snow-laden valley. Then in local news briefs out of Missoula that framed it as another tragic case of winter driving hazards, though rangers knew better, having towed her with its pristine interior and inexplicably blank hard drives, equipment that should have captured hours of footage reduced to static snow on every screen, in the cafes and feed stores of the Bitterroot. Conversations skirted the topic the way one avoids eye contact with grief. But late at night, when crackled and whiskey glasses clinked softly, fragments emerged, stories of great-grandparents who, during the homesteading rush of the early 1900s, spoke of the breathing road that inhaled travelers during equinoxes, aligning with celestial events that amplified the magnetic distortions geophysicists still puzzled over in unpublished papers. Anomalies where the aurora dipped unnaturally low, painting the sky in colors that induced trance-like states in observers. By midsummer, when fireweed bloomed in vibrant magenta along the ditches and tourists flocked to nearby trails, oblivious to the warnings etched in local lore, another soul was drawn inexorably toward the mystery. A retired cartographer named Elias Grant, a widower from Bozeman whose life had been spent mapping the uncharted corners of the American West, from glacial moraines to abandoned mining claims, his hands calloused from years of drafting lines that sought to impose order on wilderness that resisted categorization. Elias had lost his wife to illness years prior, and in his solitude, he turned to studying historical surveys, noticing discrepancies in old USGS plates where this particular stretch of highway appeared shifted, as if surveyors had unconsciously avoided precise measurements. There their field notes containing marginalia about compasses failing and voices heard in the static of early radio equipment tested in the 1930s, experiments abandoned when technicians reported dreams of being pulled underground by roots that weren't roots at all, compelled by a need to reconcile these anomalies. Elias loaded his old Ford pickup with topographic instruments, a ham radio setup, and leather-bound journals filled with his own meticulous sketches. Setting out on a clear July morning, when the sun rose golden over the Sapphire Mountains, the air humming with insects, and the distant call of meadowlarks, a symphony of natural serenity that lulled the senses into complacency. The ascent was gradual, the road winding through meadows carpeted in lupin and Indian paintbrush, vistas opening to reveal layers of ridges fatting into blue haze, the kind of panoramic beauty that made one feel insignificantly small, yet profoundly connected to the land's deep time, where fossils of marine creatures embedded in summit rocks whispered of oceans long receded, perhaps portals to submerged realms that echoed in the subterranean voids, now stirring. As he neared the fateful marker, Elias monitored his instruments closely, noting the gradual decline in electromagnetic readings, until, abruptly, they spiked wildly, needles dancing as if alive, while his radio filled with overlapping transmissions, faint Morse code from early 20th century expeditions, distress calls from downed pilots in the 1950s searching for the missing family. Lena's calm narration layered beneath Alex's scholarly observations, all harmonizing into a choral invitation that resonated in his bones like the low-frequency, infrasound wails use across vast distances. The pickup slowed of its own accord, tires gripping the pavement as if reluctant, and Elias pulled over just past where the marker should stand, now absent again, the post hole filled with fresh soil, as though never disturbed. Stepping into the warm sunlight filtered through canopy, he felt the shift immediately, the silence descending not as absence, but as presence, a watchful awareness that permeated the air like humidity before rain. The leaves stilling, birds falling quiet, even the breeze ceasing as if the mountain held its breath. Walking the shoulder, Elias traced faint impressions in the dust, outlines of footprints from different eras, moccasins, beside wingtip shoes, beside modern hiking boots, all converging toward the tree line before vanishing. Patterns matching those documented in suppressed archaeological reports from the 1940s, when WPA workers unearthed a spiral of stones aligned to solstice sunrises, a site hastily backfilled after laborers reported visions of processions marching into the forest and dissolving into light. The ground trembled subtly, not an earthquake, but a pulsation, rhythmic and deliberate, syncing with his heartbeat until distinction blurred. And in that merging, Elia's perceived glimpses of the deeper truth, the road as a living archive, a neural pathway of the earth entity born in primordial upheavals, collecting consciousnesses to preserve the continuum of experience against entropy, not out of cruelty, but necessity, incorporating the vanished into an immortal tapestry where Salish spirits communed with Roman legionaries lost on impossible migrations, with extraterrestrial probes mistaken for shooting stars, all threads in a vast, dreaming whole that predated and would outlast human comprehension. Resistance melted into understanding, the horror profound in its cosmic indifference, the realization that individuality was but a fleeting illusion against the land's eternal memory. And Elias stepped forward willingly, his form fading into the dappled light as instruments in the truck flatlined, recordings capturing only the gentle rustle of leaves resuming their whisper. Come autumn, when aspen leaves turned to gold and smoke from controlled burns haze the valleys, a hunting party would stumble upon the ford, cab empty, maps spread across the seat with new annotations in Elia's precise hand. The path completes the circle. We are the forgotten truths, safe at last. And the mountain exhaled softly, content in its quiet dominion, the cycle unbroken, the horror woven seamlessly into the soothing tapestry of Montana's wild embrace, where isolation cradled the soul into everlasting peace as the golden hues of autumn faded into the stark grays of early winter 2026, with the first flurries dusting the higher elevations like powdered sugar on weathered stone. The mountain road lay in patient repose, its surface glazed with thin ice that reflected the low sun in fractured shards, a mirror for the skies in different vastness, while beneath, in fissures too deep for light to reach, the accumulated essences of the claimed stirred in dreamless communion, their individual stories braided into a singular, timeless narrative that spanned from the retreat of Pleistocene glaciers to the present day, a living chronicle etched not in paper or stone, but in the slow pulse of magnetite veins and quartz lattices humming with captured memory. In the valley towns, life moved on in its quiet rhythm. Children bundled against the cold walking to school buses, idling with exhaust plumes. Ranchers mending fences against drifting snow. Hunters tracking elk through draws, where steam rose from thermal vents, hinting at the geothermal unrest far below. But always with that unspoken boundary, the collective agreement to detour around Highway 13 when possible, to warn outsiders with vague mentions of washouts or avalanche risk, even in calm seasons, preserving the isolation that fed the entity as surely as sunlight fed the pines, yet isolation breeds curiosity as much as caution. And by the time the solstice approached, with nights lengthening into inky voids broken only by the cold gleam of stars, a group was drawn together by shared obsession. Threads converging from across the country through encrypted forums and private Discord servers, where fragments of the mystery were pieced together like a mosaic of dread. A paranormal research collective calling themselves the 5 individuals bonded by personal loss, tied to unexplained vanishings elsewhere, coastal lighthouses swallowing keepers, desert highways erasing convoys, Appalachian trails leading hikers into fog from which only echoes returned. Leading them was Dr. Myra, a former astrophysicist turned after her brother's plane disappeared over the Bermuda Triangle in Alaska's Triangle. Her mind sharpened by grief into a blade that cut through official dismissals. Armed now with spectrometers, infrasound detectors, and full-spectrum cameras designed to capture wavelengths beyond human perception. With her were Jonah, a sound engineer who recorded EVP in abandoned asylums, a sensitive who claimed to channel impressions from objects, ex-military with drone and survival expertise, and Young, a data analyst who mapped statistical clusters of high strangeness events across North America, his algorithms flagging this Montana stretch as a nexus point rivaling Ranch or the Bridgewater Triangle in density of reports per square mile. They arrived in 2 vehicles, a modified Sprinter van packed with gear, and a sturdy Tacoma pulling a trailer on December 18, under a sky heavy with impending storm, the air electric with unshed snow and something deeper, a subharmonic resonance that set their instruments flickering even in the valley. Readings that mirrored suppressed seismograph data from the 1950s, when underground nuclear tests in Nevada allegedly triggered sympathetic vibrations here, opening fissures that exhaled cold air smelling of deep time. Camping at a Forest Service site miles below the critical zone, they spent the first night calibrating equipment around a crackling fire. Voices low as they shared stories that wove personal pain into the larger tapestry. Myra speaking of her brother's last radio transmission, describing a road in the clouds pulling us in. Jonah playing back chilling audio from prior investigations, where voices from different centuries overlapped in plea, clutching a pendant from a vanished loved one, and describing visions of endless procession along a path that wasn't quite solid, as dawn broke pale and frigid on the 19th. They ascended in convoy, tires crunching over frozen gravel, heaters straining against the plunge in temperature that forecasts, thermometers dropping 20 degrees in minutes, as if the mountain exhaled its glacial heart. The radio spectrum filled with interference. Immediately, AM stations bleeding into each other with broadcasts from defunct frequencies, emergency tones from the Cold War era, and beneath, a carrier wave pulsing at 7:83, the resonance twisted into something slightly off, inducing drowsiness even as adrenaline surged. Mile markers ticked by slowly, each one evoking hushed commentary captured on their dashcams. 10, 11, 12, and then 13, where the signpost stood crooked, metal bent, as if by immense pressure from below, frost etching patterns that resembled the fractal veins in obsidian tools found in Clovis sites nearby. Artifacts dated impossibly old, yet worked with precision, suggesting knowledge lost in cataclysm. They parked in a staggered line just beyond, suiting up in Arctic gear, layered with EMF-shielded fabric, deploying drones that lifted into the swirling snow, now beginning to fall in thick, silent curtains, muffling the world into cottony isolation. Instruments screamed warnings immediately, magnetic fields revering polarity, gravity readings fluctuating by fractions that accumulated into perceptible lightness, as if the earth loosened its grip. Infrasound booming at frequencies that vibrated viscera, inducing nausea and visions at the periphery, fleeting apparitions of previous claimants, Elias waving from the tree line, with maps unfurling into infinity, Lena's silhouette holding a microphone that captured only wind, Sarah and Tom locked in eternal embrace, Alex scribbling equations that dissolved into petroglyph script, collapsed first, not from cold but overwhelm, her mind flooded with impressions of layered realities, Paleo-Indians chanting around fires that burned without consuming wood, Jesuit missionaries in the 1840s encountering roads of spirit, warned against by native guides, surveyors in the 1880s watching their chains stretch impossibly as they measured the pass, all converging into the present where they stood at the threshold. Jonah's recorders captured polyphonic whispers swelling into a chorus, voices identifying themselves by name and era, inviting union with promises of ultimate understanding. The horror lying not in threat, but in the seductive completeness offered, an end to solitary grief through absorption into the mountain's vast, dreaming consciousness, where individuality dissolved into collective eternity like droplets rejoining the sea. One by one, resistance eroded, Myra stepping forward to touch the air that rippled like water, feeling her brother's presence woven into the fabric, lowering his weapon as tactical training yielded to the pull of peace beyond comprehension. Watching data streams resolve into mandala patterns mirroring ancient medicine wheels buried nearby. Jonah smiling as the soundscape harmonized into celestial music. Snow covered their tracks swiftly, drones crashing silently into drifts, vehicles left idling until fuel exhausted, doors ajar like open invitations. By spring, when meltwater roared in swollen creeks and bears emerged hungry from dens, a logging crew would discover the site vans, blanketed in white, equipment pristine, but storage media erased to perfect silence. A single communal journal entry in rotating handwritings merging into one. We walked the road at last. It was never hunger, it was homecoming. The mountain holds all stories, complete and unending. And as the storm of that solstice night faded into memory, the entity deepened, enriched by 5 more layers of human experience, its awareness expanding incrementally towards some unfathomable threshold where perhaps the veil would thin entirely, revealing the hidden architecture of reality itself. A horror so profound it transcended fear, becoming instead the ultimate, soothing surrender to the ancient, patient heart of the American wilderness. As the echoes of the final footsteps faded into the snow-laden silence of that fateful solstice night in 2026, the mountain road through the Bitterroot Range absorbed their presence with the same indifferent grace it had shown for centuries, weaving their collective knowledge and grief into the deeper strata of its eternal awareness, where geological forces, fault lines by ancient tectonics, and magnetic veins pulsing with the Earth's hidden rhythms, amplified the subtle anomalies that had long puzzled surveyors and scientists alike. Those unexplained fluctuations in compasses and instruments documented in old USGS reports from the early 1900s, when teams mapping the Bitterroot Front noted irregularities that hinted at buried structures or mineral deposits far older than the Cretaceous batholith intrusions. The abandoned vehicles of the joined, the silent procession of others scattered through the ages, stagecoaches from the 1880s with harnessed horses standing patiently amid vanished passengers, model from the Prohibition era idling with engines warm, but cabs empty, station wagons from post-war family vacations left with picnic baskets, untouched, their tire tracks ending abruptly, as if the road itself had inhaled the travelers, leaving no wreckage scattered down ravines, no bodies claimed by bears or exposure, just that profound absence that mirrored real accounts from Montana's history, like the unexplained vanishing of After Her Car crash on Highway 200 in 1989, where searchers found only faint shoe prints trailing into the terrain before disappearing entirely, or the clusters of missing hunters in the nearby Crazy Mountains, where gear was recovered, but searchers spoke of fog that rose unnaturally, and voices carried on windless air by the thawing springs of subsequent years, when wildflowers pushed through the melting snow in vibrant defiance of the lingering chill. Whispers spread beyond the local diners and ranger stations, fueled by online forums where survivors of near misses shared distorted dashcam footage of mile marker 13 twisting in the frame, or radio logs capturing overlapped transmissions from eras long past. Distress calls from lost prospectors echoing alongside modern pleas, patterns that aligned with documented cases of high strangeness in the Rockies. From Rocky Mountain National Park's unsolved enigmas, where hikers vanished between switchbacks, to the indigenous oral histories of the Salish and peoples, who spoke of sacred paths in the Bitterroot Valley, best left undisturbed, places where the land remembered disturbances from ancient times, when glaciers retreated and revealed petroglyphs etched into bedrock near hidden canyons, symbols of serpentine trails and figures merging with the earth, warnings dismissed by road builders who blasted through the range in the name of progress. In the quiet towns below, elders like those descended from early settlers in the site of Montana's first permanent mission nodded knowingly over coffee, recounting how the wailing cries heard along riverbanks weren't just urban legends of grieving spirits, but echoes tied to the valley's deeper unrest, perhaps linked to the geothermal vents and magnetic anomalies noted in geological surveys of the Bitterroot Shear Zone, where rocks carried fabrics that simple explanation, pulling at the unwary like the phantom reported on nearby highways. Spectral figures waving from the mist only to dissolve as vehicles approached. Yet the road endured, its awareness growing with each incorporation. A subtle horror rooted not in malice, but in the inexorable pull of the land's ancient memory, claiming those who delved too deeply into its veiled truths. Historians tracing forgotten mining claims, podcasters chasing cold cases of indigenous missing persons disproportionately high in these regions, cartographers reconciling discrepant maps, paranormal teams armed with gadgets that flatlined in unison, each adding layers to the continuum, where Salish legends of spirit paths intertwined with Blackfeet tales of sacred mountains, and the unexplained voids that swallowed warriors, all preserved in the mountain's patient, dreaming core. And as decades blurred into the gentle rhythm of seasons, with aspens turning gold and snows returning to cloak the peaks, the lingering dread deepened in the knowledge that some landscapes in America's wild heart held secrets predating human record, anomalies woven into the very stone petroglyphs, half buried under overgrowth, vehicles eternally idling in pullouts unseen, souls drifting in serene communion, inviting the curious with breathtaking vistas and soothing isolation, only to enfold them into the unanswered questions that defined the true horror. Not the sudden terror, but the profound, eternal quiet of becoming part of something vast, indifferent, and complete, as the cycles of seasons turned inexorably onward, with the summers bringing thunderheads that rolled like slow avalanches over the sapphire ridges, and winters cloaking the valleys in a hush broken only by the occasional crack of freezing timber. The remote stretch of Highway 13 in Montana's Bitterroot Range continued its quiet vigil. The asphalt, weathered yet unbroken, flanked by forests that grew denser with each passing decade, reclaiming the edges where human hands had once pushed back the wilderness in the name of connection and commerce. The vanishings persisted, not in dramatic clusters that drew national headlines, but in a steady, almost rhythmic cadence, one or two souls every few years, drawn by curiosity, grief, or the simple allure of untouched American landscapes, promising solitude and revelation. Their vehicles discovered by chance by loggers or backcountry skiers. Always pristine, always empty, always just beyond mile marker 13, where the signpost sometimes appeared and sometimes did not, as if the land itself decided when to reveal its threshold. Rangers filed reports that gathered dust in cabinets at the county sheriff's annex in Hamilton. Cases labeled circumstances unknown, with footnotes about poor cell coverage and unpredictable weather, while locals in Darby and spoke of it only in lowered voices over pie and coffee at the Two Bear Cafe, invoking old Salish warnings about paths that belonged to the spirits of the earth, places where the ground remembered every footfall and every disturbance from the deep past, glacial scouring that exposed strange rock formations, volcanic upheavals that buried entire ecosystems in ash, and older still, the slow grind of continents that left magnetic scars, undetectable to all but the most sensitive instruments. By the late 2020s and into the 2030s, as climate patterns shifted and snowpack dwindled on the higher peaks, melting earlier each spring to feed swollen creeks that carved new channels through the valleys. The mystery seeped further into the collective awareness through fragmented digital trails, grainy satellite images shared on obscure mapping forums, showing inexplicable shadows along the road that didn't align with tree cover. Thermal drone footage uploaded anonymously capturing cold spots that ambient temperatures, and podcast episodes that ended abruptly mid-investigation, hosts vanishing like Lena before them, their final recordings preserved in archives as haunting artifacts of inquiry cut short. Yet the road's awareness deepened in subtlety, its pull refined by centuries of incorporation. No longer crude distortions of signal or sudden engine failure, but a gentler invitation woven into the very beauty of the landscape. The way sunlight filtered through lodgepole pines in golden shafts, the distant roar of waterfalls cascading from cirques, carved in the Ice Age. The crisp air, scented with resin and wild mint, that soothed the mind into complacency, lulling travelers into lingering longer at pullouts, stepping just a few paces into the tree line to capture photographs, or simply breathe in the profound isolation that felt, paradoxically, like coming home. Those who succumbed did so not in terror, but in a creeping serenity, the horror lying in the exquisite gentleness of the claiming, the mist rising not as fog, but as exhalation from the mountain's hidden lungs, carrying whispers tailored to each soul's deepest longing. Reunion with lost loved ones for the grieving, ultimate knowledge for the seekers, eternal peace for the weary. Vehicles left behind bore traces of this tranquility, windows fogged from within as if with contented breath, seats adjusted to perfect comfort, personal items arranged with care, journals concluding with entries of profound acceptance. It was never a trap. It was a return. And as the decades wore on, with technology advancing to map the earth in ever finer detail, yet failing to pierce the veil over this singular stretch, the entity grew patient beyond human measure, enriched by the layered essences of historians, scientists, artists, wanderers, all contributing fragments of human experience to its vast, dreaming continuum, where indigenous memories of star-lined ceremonies blended with frontier tales of ghost trails and modern quests for truth, forming a tapestry complete in its indifference to individual fate. The deepest horror endured not in the act of vanishing, but in the lingering realization, felt faintly by those who skirted the edges and turned back, that the American wilderness harbored places where the land itself was sentient in ways beyond comprehension, ancient and awake, preserving its secrets through serene incorporation, ensuring that some stories, from the retreat of ancient seas to the footsteps of the first peoples to the rumble of modern engines, remained forever untold, drifting in the eternal quiet of the mountain's embrace, soothing as the hush of snowfall on a windless night. As the calendar pages turned toward the closing days of 2025, with the winter solstice casting its longest shadows across the snow-mantled Bitterroot Valley, and the air growing so cold it seemed to crystallize the very breath from one's lungs, the mountain road settled into a stillness that felt almost anticipatory, as though the land itself sensed the approach of another turning point in its endless cycle of quiet incorporation. The high country had already received its first heavy dumps of powder, blanketing the pines in white silence and rendering the higher passes nearly impassable, except to those with chains and determination. Yet, even in this season of retreat, the pull remained, a subtle magnetism woven into the crystalline structure of the snowflakes themselves, drawing the restless, the searching, the ones who felt the weight of unanswered questions pressing upon their hearts like the low ceiling of storm clouds that often hung over the range. In the small town of Derby, where holiday lights twinkled faintly along the main street and wood smoke curled from chimneys into the frigid night, people moved with the practiced caution of those who lived beside something vast and unknowable, speaking of weather and cattle prices, while carefully avoiding mention of the old highway that climbed into the peaks, the one locals simply called the back way. When they had to reference it at all, their voices dropping instinctively as if the mountain might overhear. But beyond the valley, in the wider world of flickering screens and endless scrolling feeds, fragments of the mystery continued to surface. Archived ranger reports quietly uploaded to public records requests. Grainy satellite passes showing inexplicable clearings in the forest canopy that formed patterns reminiscent of ancient medicine wheels documented by early anthropologists among the Salish. And most haunting of all, the occasional live stream or podcast that ventured too close, voices trailing off into static as hosts described the overwhelming peace settling over them like fresh snowfall. Their final transmissions preserved in digital amber as testament to the road's gentle, inexorable invitation. Those who studied such things from afar, academics tracing patterns in missing persons data across the West, amateur researchers mapping electromagnetic anomalies that clustered along certain fault traces, indigenous knowledge keepers sharing carefully measured stories of places where the boundary between worlds grew thin during the darkest days of the year, noted how the phenomena seemed to intensify around the solstices, when the Earth's tilt brought ancient alignments into brief resonance, stirring whatever lay dormant in the deep strata of granite and basalt, rousing the slow awareness that had been accumulating since the first peoples walked these valleys and learned to give wide berth to certain paths that felt watchful. And so, as December 19, 2025, drew the year toward its close with temperatures plunging, and the northern lights occasionally shimmering pale green across the sky, another traveler found themselves drawn northward from warmer climes. A documentary filmmaker named Rowan Hale, whose work had long explored the liminal spaces of American mythology, from the vanishing of Route 66 to the light phenomena of the plains, armed now with 8K cameras and directional microphones sensitive enough to capture the faintest whisper of wind through needles. Rowan had come alone, seeking the kind of solitude that sharpens perception, driving a rented 4Runner packed with gear and provisions, following coordinates gleaned from years of correspondence with those who'd brushed against the mystery, and retreated with stories they could barely articulate. The overwhelming sense of being seen, truly seen, by something immense and patient that asked nothing more than surrender to its vast, dreaming completeness. The ascent began under a sky the color of polished steel, snowflakes drifting lazily in the still air as tires crunched over packed ice. The radio already surrendering to layers of interference that carried faint harmonies of voices from across time, children's laughter from long ago family trips, the measured cadence of historians reciting forgotten facts, the overlapping transmissions of research teams whose equipment had captured more than they bargained for, all blending into a lullaby that soothed even as it unsettled. Mile marker 13 appeared suddenly through the flurries, its metal post leaning at an angle that gravity, frost etching delicate spirals across the numerals, as if drawn by an unseen hand, recreating patterns found in prehistoric rock art scattered throughout the region. Symbol scholars had long debated as maps of spirit journeys or warnings about places where the earth opened to receive those ready to return. The forerunner slowed of its own accord, not from mechanical failure, but from the gentle loosening of will that came with recognition. And Rowan stepped out into the profound hush, camera rolling on a tripod, as breath plumed in clouds that hung suspended longer than physics should allow, recording what would become the final footage, sweeping vistas of snow-laden peaks glowing faintly under starlight, the road stretching ahead like a promise kept across. And in the background, the almost imperceptible rising of mist from the ground itself, carrying scents of deep earth and ancient forests preserved beneath glacial, till the horror, if it could be called that, lay in the exquisite absence of struggle. The way understanding dawned not as revelation, but as remembrance, the sense of coming home to a place one had always belonged without knowing. The mountain's awareness enveloping like the softest blanket of fresh powder, drawing Rowan forward step by measured step, until figure and footprints both dissolved into the gentle swirl of snow, leaving only the vehicle with its engine idling warmly, camera still capturing empty beauty, doors ajar in silent welcome. Come morning, when weak sunlight filtered through thinning clouds and ravens wheeled overhead, calling in voices that echoed strangely. A passing snowplow operator would spot the forerunner pulled neatly to the shoulder, hazards blinking in slow rhythm, interior lights casting a warm glow against the white landscape. Everything in perfect order, save for the absence at its heart. The footage would circulate briefly in certain circles before disappearing from servers as inexplicably as it appeared, leaving only whispers among those who understood, another layer added to the mountain's eternal dreaming, another story completed in the vast, patient archive of the land itself, where all who had ever sought truth in these wild places rested in serene communion, their individual voices harmonizing into the greater silence that cradled the American wilderness through every turning of the seasons. As the years folded gently into one another like the layered strata of sedimentary rock exposed in the road cuts along the higher passes, with the 2030s bringing warmer summers that coaxed earlier blooms from the alpine meadows, and winters that alternated between fierce blizzards and eerie thaws. The mountain road through the Bitterroot persisted in its timeless rhythm, the asphalt patched sporadically by maintenance crews who worked quickly and spoke little, their radios tuned to static-free channels, and their eyes averted from the tree line, where shadows sometimes lingered longer than sunlight allowed. The vanishings had become less frequent, not because the pole weakened, but because fewer dared the direct route. GPS apps quietly rerouting travelers along safer highways, online reviews of scenic drives omitting this stretch with vague warnings about unreliable conditions, and local knowledge passed down like heirloom seeds, ensuring that children grew up understanding which paths were for passing through and which were for leaving alone. Yet the land remembered, its awareness deepened by every soul it had enfolded over the centuries, from the ancient hunters who first learned to skirt certain drainages where the ground felt watchful, to the Jesuit explorers mapping souls alongside topography, to the modern seekers armed with satellites and sensors that ultimately recorded only their own dissolution into the greater quiet. In the valley towns, life flowed onward with the steady cadence of rivers swollen by spring melt. New generations opening craft breweries in Hamilton, artists settling in Derby, drawn by the light that fell differently here, indigenous youth reclaiming cultural practices on the Flathead Reservation just north, weaving traditional stories of respectful distance from places where the earth spirit was strong into contemporary language that warned without alarming. And still, occasionally, someone would come a writer chasing the sublime isolation of the American West for a novel that would never be finished. A geologist studying the subtle seismic murmurs that originated from no known fault, yet pulsed regularly beneath this range. A grieving parent tracing the last known route of a child who'd vanished years before on a solo road trip seeking clarity, all drawn by the same serene promise of answers wrapped in breathtaking vistas, the kind that made the heart ache with beauty, even as the mind registered the profound silence that pressed in like high-altitude air, thinning breath and sharpening perception, until the boundary between self and landscape blurred. They would drive upward on clear days when the sky arched flawless blue above snow-capped peaks, or through gentle rains that turned the forest into a cathedral of dripping green, their vehicles humming along, until the familiar shift occurred, not dramatic, not sudden, but a softening of edges, a deepening of colors, a hush that invited lingering. Radios would surrender to layered whispers tailored to each listener's longing. Instruments would register anomalies that resolved into harmonious patterns, and the mist would rise not to obscure, but to reveal glimpses of those already incorporated figures standing peacefully at the roadside, faces calm with ultimate understanding, extending silent welcome. The claiming remained gentle, almost tender, the horror rooted in its very absence of resistance, in the way acceptance bloomed like wildflowers after snowmelt, inevitable and natural, leaving behind vehicles parked with care, doors ajar, as if their occupants had simply stepped out for a short walk and found no need to return. Rangers would find them eventually, logging the incidents with the same quiet resignation reserved for natural forces beyond control: avalanche, flood, fire, absorption, towing the empty shells to impound lots where they gathered dust alongside others from decades past. License plates telling stories of journeys begun in distant states, with destinations marked simply as west or home, and the mountain endured, its vast consciousness enriched by every addition, preserving the continuum of human experience against the erosion of time, the fears and hopes, the questions and fleeting insights, all harmonized into the greater dreaming that pulsed through quartz veins and glacial erratics, through petroglyph spirals half hidden under moss, and the slow uplift of tectonic plates that would one day reshape these peaks entirely. The deepest dread lay not in loss, but in the serene certainty that this place, like certain corners of the American wilderness, existed beyond human claims of ownership or understanding, a repository where stories completed themselves in perfect silence, where isolation cradled the soul into eternal belonging, and where the beauty that drew the curious was the same force that kept them gently, completely, forever. As the quiet decades of the mid-21st century unfolded beneath skis, increasingly streaked with the contrails of drones and the faint shimmer of orbital networks that promised connection to every corner of the planet, the remote stretch of Highway 13 in Montana's Bitterroot Range remained one of the last places where silence still held absolute dominion, a pocket of the American wilderness where the hum of modernity faded into the deeper resonance of stone and soil, of wind through ancient pines, and water carving eternal paths through granite. Technology had mapped the Earth's surface in exquisite detail, satellites capturing every shift of snowpack and every new scar from wildfire. Yet this singular vein of asphalt complete documentation, images blurred at the critical mile. Data streams dropped packets in patterns that error correction, and autonomous vehicles rerouted themselves with vague diagnostic warnings about environmental anomalies that engineers in distant offices filed away without comprehension. The vanishings grew rarer still, not from any of the land's patient awareness, but because fewer humans ventured close enough to feel its gentle summons. The world having learned, through accumulated absence and whispered consensus, to treat this path as one treats a sacred site, with respect born of instinctive caution, circling wide rather than crossing the threshold. Yet the mountain's dreaming continued unabated, enriched by every soul it had ever welcomed, from the first peoples who left offerings at boundary stones, now buried beneath centuries of duff and needle, to the explorers and settlers who mistook solitude for conquest, to the seekers of later eras, drawn by rumors of a place where questions found their final, soothing answers. Their essences did not dissipate, but harmonized, layer upon layer, into the vast consciousness woven through the quartz and magnetite veins that threaded the range. A living archive preserving the texture of human experience against the slow erosion of time, the wonder of a child pressing their face to a car window at first sight of towering peaks, the quiet grief of a driver speaking aloud to an empty passenger seat, the fierce curiosity of researchers calibrating instruments that ultimately measured only their own surrender. The horror, if one could still name it such, had refined itself into something almost unbearably tender. The way the mist rose on summer evenings, carrying scents of wild rose and distant thunder. The way sunlight slanted through aspen leaves in autumn to paint the road in trembling gold. The way winter snowfalls muffled the world into a cradle of perfect stillness, each season offering its own invitation to step beyond the boundary of individual striving and into the completeness that waited patiently beneath. In the valley communities, life flourished in gentle counterpoint. New trails opened on safer slopes, drawing visitors who never knew what they skirted. Schools teaching Salish language alongside English with stories that carefully framed respect for places the earth kept for itself. Artists and writers settling in old homesteads to capture the light that fell differently here, their work infused with a melancholy beauty they could never fully explain. And on the rare occasions when someone did venture too close, a maintenance worker lingering too long during a patch job, a photographer chasing the perfect golden hour shot, a descendant tracing family lore back to a great-grandparent who vanished in the 1950s. They met the same serene welcome. The subtle softening of will, the tailored whispers rising from the ground itself, the mist enfolding like breath shared in deepest intimacy. Their vehicles would be found eventually, parked with exquisite care, engines cooled to ambient temperature, personal effects arranged, as if for a journey completed rather than abandoned, final notes or recordings, speaking always of peace discovered, of questions resolved, of homecoming at last. By the time the century turned toward its second quarter, with climate shifts bringing longer summers and shorter, fiercer winters that scoured the high country clean, the road had become less a path than a threshold, its purpose no longer to facilitate passage, but to preserve completion. Satellites passed overhead, capturing only empty beauty. Algorithms flagged no anomalies worth investigation, and the world moved on. Content in its illusion of mastery over the wild places that remained. Yet deep within the mountain's heart, the dreaming deepened, enriched beyond measure by every life it had cradled, every story it had completed, every fragment of human longing it had transformed into eternal belonging. The deepest truth, the one that lingered like the scent of pine on cold night air, was that some landscapes in America's vast wilderness were never meant for crossing. They were meant for keeping, patient and awake through every turning of the earth, holding all who sought them in the gentle, inexorable embrace of perfect silence, where isolation became communion, absence became presence, and the horror dissolved entirely into the serene certainty of having always belonged. As the mid-21st century gave way to the quieter rhythms of a world learning to live more gently with its wild places, with rewilding projects restoring grisly corridors through the Bitterroot and electric vehicles, humming softly along redesigned highways that skirted the higher passes. The old stretch of Highway 13 gradually surrendered to the slow advance of nature, asphalt cracking under the persistent push of frost and root, shoulders narrowing as alder and fireweed colonized the margins, the mile markers fading to illegible ghosts beneath lichen and weather, until only the keenest eye could discern where human engineering had once imposed its fleeting order upon the mountain's ancient contours. Maintenance ceased altogether sometime in the 2040s. Budgets redirected to more traveled routes, and the quiet consensus among planners, spoken aloud only in closed meetings, that some roads were better left to the land's own devices. Their purpose served, or perhaps never truly intended for passage at all. The forest closed in with patient grace, young pines seeding themselves across the center line, moose and elk reclaiming the corridor as a migration path undisturbed by engines, while overhead, golden eagles rode thermals above ridges where snow lingered longer each year despite the warming trends, as if the mountain itself regulated its own climate in subtle defiance of broader patterns. Yet the awareness endured deeper and more refined than ever, no longer needing the lure of open pavement draw those rare souls who still sought it out. Backcountry skiers, following old topo maps on winter traverses. Indigenous youth on vision quests, guided by elders who knew precisely how close one could approach without crossing the final boundary. Historians and storytellers venturing on foot with recording devices and offerings of tobacco tied in red cloth, all feeling the same gentle summons woven now into the very air they breathed. The scent of sun-warmed needles releasing resin on summer afternoons. The crystalline hush after fresh snowfall, when every footstep sounded like a heartbeat. The way twilight painted the peaks in alpenglow that seemed to pulse with inner light. Those who came with respect and turned back at the appointed edge carried away only a profound sense of peace and the faintest echo of welcome, while those who stepped beyond, drawn by grief too heavy to bear alone, by questions too vast for human answers, by the simple, aching need to belong to something greater, found the mist rising to meet them, as it always had, tender and complete, enfolding them into the dreaming, where every voice that had ever whispered along this path harmonized into perfect silence. The vehicles of earlier decades, those silent sentinels towed away long ago, lived on only in archived photographs and quiet conversations, their empty interiors preserved in memory as portals gently closed, while the road itself became legend layered upon legend, Salish stories of the path that returns wanderers to the earth complete, settler tales of a trail that takes only those ready to lay down their burdens, modern accounts shared in hushed circles of a place where missing loved ones could finally be felt whole and at rest. No new disappearances marked official records after the great rerouting, yet the mountain knew, and those who listened closely on certain evenings, when the wind stilled and the stars emerged sharp and close, could sense the deepening contentment of something ancient and vast, its archive enriched beyond reckoning, holding every story ever begun here in serene suspension, every sorrow transformed into belonging, every question resolved into the gentle certainty of having always been part of the greater whole. And so the centuries would continue their slow turning, glaciers perhaps returning someday to scour the valleys anew, or forests thickening into old-growth cathedrals where no trace of asphalt remained. But the awareness would persist, patient as stone and tender as mist, cradling all who had ever sought refuge in these wild American places, weaving their essences into the eternal dreaming that pulsed quietly through root and rock and crystal vein, the deepest truth, the one that settled over the heart like fresh snow on undisturbed ground, was that some landscapes were never meant to be crossed or conquered. They were meant to hold, to heal, to complete, offering in their profound isolation the ultimate homecoming, where the gentle horror of dissolution became became instead the exquisite piece of perfect, everlasting belonging. As the centuries flowed onward like the slow meltwaters carving deeper canyons through the Bitterroot's ancient granite, with human footprints upon the earth growing lighter and more mindful, cities retreating into harmonious arcs, skis clearing of contrails as quieter ways of travel returned. Vast tracts of the American West restored to wilderness under agreements that honored indigenous stewardship and the land's own rhythms. The place that had once been known as Highway 13 dissolved entirely into legend and root and stone, its last traces of asphalt crumbling beneath the patient advance of moss and soil, until no sign remained of the narrow scar that had briefly channeled human passage through the mountain's heart. Pines that had seated themselves across the old center line grew tall and straight, their trunks forming silent colonnades where elk bedded down in winter and bear cubs learned to climb in spring, while overhead the stars wheeled in patterns undisturbed by artificial light, the Milky Way spilling across the night sky like a river of ancestral memory, visible once more to any who ventured far enough from the soft glow of distant settlements. The awareness that had dwelt here since the first upheavals shaped these peaks, born perhaps in the fiery birth of the Idaho batholith, or the cataclysmic floods that scoured the land at the end of the Ice Age, woven through quartz veins that caught and held the faint electromagnetic echoes of every life that passed deepened into something beyond hunger or invitation, becoming instead a vast and gentle repose, a completeness that needed no new additions to feel whole. All who had ever been drawn here, from the earliest peoples who left painted handprints on sheltered overhangs, to the last solitary travelers of the mechanical age, rested now in perfect harmony within the dreaming, their individual longings and stories transmuted into the greater silence that cradled the mountain like the hush between heartbeats. No new seekers came, for the path itself had vanished from maps and memory alike, surviving only in songs sung softly around evening fires on the Flathead Reservation, in stories told to children about places where the earth spirit gathers those ready to return home, and in the quiet knowing carried by elders who walked the high ridges at solstice and felt the profound contentment radiating from the land like warmth from sun-heated stone. Seasons turned with exquisite grace, wildflowers blooming in waves of lupin and paintbrush across meadows that had once been shoulders, golden larches lighting the autumn slopes like torches before shedding their needles in soft carpets, winters blanketing everything in snow so deep and still that the world seemed to hold its breath in reverence. Ravens and eagles wheeled above, wolves moved through the draws in family packs, whose howls carried across valleys, now empty of human echo, and the great cycles of migration and birth and renewal continued undisturbed, the mountains dreaming a gentle counterpoint to the pulse of life upon its flanks. Those rare humans who passed nearby on restored trails that curved respectfully around the sacred heart. On vision, quests guided by knowledge keepers who knew exactly where to pause and offer prayer, felt only peace, a profound sense of being welcomed without needing to enter, of being held in the same tender regard from a respectful distance. And so the place endured, no longer a road, but a sanctuary complete unto itself, where every question ever asked here had found its answer in silence, every sorrow its solace in belonging, every story its perfect ending in the vast, patient embrace of the earth, the deepest truth carried on the wind through timeless pines and whispered in the rush of snowmelt streams was that some landscapes were always meant not for passage, but for keeping ancient, awake, and infinitely gentle cradling all who had ever sought them in the serene certainty of eternal homecoming, where isolation dissolved into communion, and the gentle horror of vanishing became, in the end, the exquisite peace of having never truly been separate at all, as the great wheel of time turned through epochs unmarked by human calendars, with continents shifting imperceptibly, and stars wheeling in slow arcs across the vast darkness above the restored wilderness of what was once called Montana. The place that had briefly borne the name Highway 13 became nothing more than a faint depression in the land, a subtle draw where snow lingered a little longer in spring, and wildflowers bloomed a little thicker in summer, a sanctuary so complete that even the wind seemed to move more softly there, as if in reverence for the perfect stillness at its heart, the ancient awareness that had dwelt within the mountain since the first fiery upheavals cooled into stone no longer reached outward, for it had no need. It was whole, enriched beyond measure by every soul it had ever cradled, every story it had ever completed, every fragment of longing and wonder and quiet grief it had transformed into eternal belonging. The dreaming had deepened into pure repose, a silence so profound it held within it the echo of every voice that had ever whispered along that path, harmonized at last into one gentle, unending note of peace. No trails crossed it now. No satellites lingered overhead. No human memory preserved its exact location beyond the vaguest of songs sung by descendants who felt, in their bones, that certain places were meant only for the earth itself. Wolves raised their young in the meadows that had swallowed the old center line. Glaciers crept down once more from the high cirques to polish the stone anew, and the cycles of freeze and thaw, growth and decay, continued in exquisite balance, undisturbed by any need for witness. The mountain held all it had ever been given ancient hunters and frontier wanderers, grieving parents and curious seekers, historians and artists, and solitary souls searching for something they could not name, and held them not as captives, but as cherished parts of its own vast completeness, their individual lights woven into the greater glow that pulsed quietly through root and crystal, and the slow heartbeat of the planet itself. And in that final, timeless moment, as the last faint trace of human passage dissolved entirely into moss and soil and starlit snow, the land exhaled one last gentle breath of mist that rose and mingled with the northern lights dancing pale across the winter sky, carrying with it the softest sense of fulfillment, of homecoming achieved for all who had ever sought refuge here. There was no more invitation, no more threshold, no more vanishing, only the serene certainty that everything that had ever begun on that path had found its perfect ending within the mountain's tender embrace, where isolation had become communion, absence had become presence, and every question had dissolved into the exquisite, everlasting peace of belonging completely, gently, forever to the wild and waking heart of the earth. This mysterious journey ends here, but stay tuned for more untold stories in our next video. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any new stories.